Sometime back, I was asked, where do I get a lot of my ideas for sermons and messages that I preach? And one of the ways and places that I get them from is what I'm actively learning and what I'm studying. Recently, I've been listening a lot to a specific podcast, and it's going in through the book of Revelation. So some of the stuff I've talked about recently kind of deals with Revelation, and I've preached, I think, maybe about a month or so back out of one of the earlier chapters of the book of Revelation. Now, so today's sermon, of course, takes place from that book. And one of the things I want to note before I get into the sermon itself is this. There's a few quick things you need to know anytime that you study the book of Revelation. There are, and I talked about this not too long ago in one of my previous sermons, that there are different levels of understanding. There's a historical understanding of a teaching, there is the moral implication of the teaching, and then there's the spiritual level of that teaching as well. And one of the interesting things about the book of Revelation is a lot of the things in the book of Revelation are actually tied to the time period, but that doesn't mean that it still doesn't apply today. And what that means is, for instance, a perfect example I can think of is in the book of Revelation talks about this beast with 7 heads and how one of the heads was mortally wounded. And the wording there implies heavily Nero, because Nero actually killed himself. He actually, if I remember correctly, either cut his throat or something to that effect. And the emperor basically plunged the empire into a civil war. It took place for over a year. There was a year of 4 emperors, they call it, where no one could gain control. And everyone talked about how afterward the empire should have died, but didn't. And so that's kind of an implication of one of the teachings, but the thing is that doesn't mean that's just the only teaching out of that. And so what's important is that you have to realize the author's intended meaning when he's writing the works and putting these things together for us, but just because there's one thing at that time period doesn't change that may have implications for a future time period. But whenever you begin to look at Revelation through those eyes, make sure that above all else, you never marry yourself to one idea. And the reason why is because in the Old Testament, there was a number of prophecies about the coming of Christ. And whenever all these prophecies finally came to be, the people who studied the law had their own idea of what they thought Christ was going to be like when he came. So when he did come, they totally missed it. And so it's one of those things that never marry yourself to one interpretation heavily, but rather, though, whenever you look at the book of Revelation, be very open-minded, of course not to the point where your mind falls out, but make sure that you're open-minded to things that maybe you didn't consider it the way that you would consider it before. And that way, then, you're never missing the big picture. Now, the passages we're going to deal with today is in the book of Revelation, chapter 6, and it's one of those things where we're talking about the opening of the seals. And the importance and the significance of this passage is it tells us much, but it's a very, very vague passage. There are other passages that are more specific. And the reason why this one is vague, we'll get into in a little bit. But there's a couple things before I get there why I want to talk about this. The teaching I'm going to share with you today comes from a fella by the name of Irenaeus. Some of you have heard me mention his name before, and it's important to note who he is. Why is Irenaeus important? Well, Irenaeus is important because of a guy by the name of Polycarp. Well, who's Polycarp and why is he important? Polycarp was a first-hand disciple of John. And so what that means is he literally sat and talked and learned from John. He got his faith from John. He was a convert to Christianity from John, the one who wrote the book of Revelation. And in fact, there's an interesting thing. Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, it is because of him that the book of John is one of the 4 Gospels. He was the one who made the case to actually include it in the Bible. He is the one who, as a result, and what's interesting is, had it not been for the book of Revelation, the book of John would never have been included as one of the 4 Gospels. But he actually made the argument from the book of Revelation why John needed to be included as one of the 4 Gospels. And it's an amazing story, and it's almost a story in and of itself. But what's amazing about it, though, is this. Irenaeus sat firsthand and learned from Polycarp. He was converted by Polycarp. Polycarp was converted by John. And there's some people who would imply that it's a very good possibility Irenaeus himself may have met John. Some have said that. I don't know if it's true or not. But the thing is, it's kind of one of those things where if I was to tell you that at my home I have 3 cats, 2 we own, you could say, well, Wes isn't going to lie to me. I trust him. And then you can go and you can tell a friend of yours, and even though they don't know me or maybe have never met me, they can tell them, hey, yeah, I got a handful of pets at my house. And there's these 2 cats, there's this dog, and there's this other cat that just kind of shows up. He's the neighborhood cat, but we love him anyways, and he's a part of our home now. And it's one of those, it's kind of the whole 6 degrees of separation of Kevin Bacon, if you remember that game from years ago, that whole separation by degrees. And so that's how you can get good information. So a lot of the information today we're going to talk about actually comes from a guy by the name of Irenaeus. So let's jump right in. Revelation chapter 6, verse 1. And it says, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say, in a voice like thunder, come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. So we're going to talk about they call them oftentimes the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Now, this is going to be one of those sermons where it's not necessarily going to be a lot of application to our lives, but it's more for information for you. It's something for you to put in your mind and kind of say, you know what, I need to think about this. This is something worthy of studying. It's something to kind of be aware of. And so it's one of those things where whenever I come across information, I love sharing it. And so that's what I wanted to do. This first seal he opens, and this lamb, of course, being Christ himself, he opens the seal. The interesting thing that they note is this. If the lamb himself is opening the seal, he can't be the rider coming out of the seal. And they kind of make that distinction. And the important thing is, what is this rider? And you'll notice it says, this rider was on a white horse. He held a bow and was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. You'll notice something. Whenever we get to the next riders, there's always bad things associated with them. There is nothing bad associated with this horse. He comes out, he's white, which you see white oftentimes as a reference to God, godliness, to Christ. And you also see, of course, he's given a bow and he's given a crown. He is a ruler, he is a king. And he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. It doesn't say people died because of him. It doesn't say that he slew people, but instead he is a conqueror. Irenaeus tells us this is the gospel itself. When I first heard that, I thought to myself, well, how is this possible? Because that's not what I was always taught. I was told this is one of the horsemen, one of the conquerors. But the reality is what has the gospel itself done? By the time that Irenaeus lived, you're talking into the late hundreds. So you're talking about a good 158 years after the life of Christ. By that time period, the gospel had been preached in much of the known world. At that point, the gospel had already been to Britain. It had already been into Spain. It had been across North Africa. Had already gone into India. Had already gone into the southern parts in Africa, down the Nile River. Hasn't been everywhere, but has been much of the known world. If I remember correctly, I don't remember if it was Matthew, but there was one of the disciples of Christ, one of the 12, was a martyr in India. The gospel had gone forth and was conquering. And it was bringing people, as a crown, into its kingdom. And so when he's talking about that, he's talking about the spread and influence of the gospel of Christ itself. And by the time that Irenaeus is looking at this book and he's studying it, he's already seen that played out. He has seen how it has in fact spread. And what you find, and what's most amazing to me is this. If you look in Europe especially, which of course most of us we're all European ancestry, we find that Christianity had a stronghold in Europe. And it spread so very quickly. And one of the reasons it spread was mostly because of the Roman Empire. The Romans heavily tried to stop Christianity, but it couldn't. And that brings us to our next horse. It says in verse 3, when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard a second living creature say, come. And then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. A fiery red one. This is where you notice that first one, he doesn't talk about him conquering, destroying. He talks about conquering, yes, but not destroying. He doesn't talk about ending things. But this one, though, says he has given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. This red horse rider is a reference to Rome itself. And the reason why is this. There had never been a culture prior to that who loved brutality. And if you look at the Romans, you think about the Colosseums, you think about the destruction, you see about the things that took place there. That was a part of their culture. They loved bloodshed. And so he's talking about not just Rome, but he's also talking at large about the idea of persecution itself. Now, what's interesting is here in chapter 6, he's giving more general ideas. We're going to get, whenever you get into some of the later ones, he actually gets more specific. And some of those things you can even pin into our time period. But into this stuff, he's talking about this generalization of persecution itself. And it talks about the idea of the blood of the martyrs being the seedbed of the church. And that's what this red implies, blood itself. He is one to shed blood. He is the one to cause violence. He is the one to persecute and to try to destroy. Let's read on. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures say, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage. And do not damage the oil and the wine. So what you find is this next creature comes, this next horse, and he's black. And we recognize him as, in a lot of ways, I guess you could call it famine. That's one thing associated with him, but he's also associated with the next. But if you think about this, what happens a lot of times after war? Now, today, we don't really live in this type of a world anymore. War today is a little different. But back in their time period, after war, what would you see? You would see a lot of famine. You would see a lot of disease. You would see a lot of cultural breakdown. And that's what you're seeing here with this horse as he comes out. And he says a day's wage basically will barely get you a loaf of bread. A day's wage will barely get you enough to feed your family. A day's worth of work that would regularly pay for your home, the roof over your head, and the clothing that you would need, and for the utensils you would need in your home, will barely buy a loaf of bread to feed your children. But then he says, don't harm the oil and the wine. That had always puzzled me. The original teaching, when I first ever read this, it taught me this, and this is what it said. It said, the rich and the wealthy, and this was right out of the whatever Bible book I was reading whenever I was first reading this, it said the rich and the wealthy won't be harmed because they can handle that. If stuff costs a little more, well, they've got wealth on hand, so it's not going to harm them. The teaching that I discovered, though, and this is one that brought me great hope. The other day when I was listening to this, they said, it's entirely possible. That is kind of a good point. That's the way a lot of people would think about it. But there's something missing out of that. Do not harm the oil and do not harm the wine. Wine. Wine itself. Wine was used in religious ceremonies. The early church used it as a part of their unions as they would come together, the Eucharistic meal, the communion as we would call it. Don't harm the wine. Now, yeah, the bread's being harmed, but don't harm the wine. And it also makes note to oil. What's oil used for? For anointing. So what they're saying is that in spite of all of this, during that time period, the church itself, even though it lives in a world that's ravaged and targeted against it by the red horse and the rider upon it, even so, afterward, you have terrible famine and chaotic disruptions within the world. Even so, the church would still thrive. Don't harm the wine and don't harm the oil. Oil was used oftentimes for anointing. In fact, the book of James talks about whenever a person is sick or ill, to go to them to anoint them with oil. And that's what they did in their time. And culturally, I kind of think anymore, maybe it's what we should do now. I think it's not a bad idea. And what's interesting, though, is that they're saying not to harm the oil, not to harm the wine. These are things that are tied to religious worship. In other words, the church, despite the persecutions, would not fail. When John was writing the book of Revelation, a lot of people don't realize it, but the church at that point gotten so heavily persecuted that Christians were just being rounded up and massacred. The Romans liked blood. If I remember correctly, Polycarp, the man we'd referenced earlier, was one of the first Christians killed by lions in the Colosseum. And he was killed with a number of his disciples with him. And if I remember correctly, I believe one of the disciples killed with him was a female, one of the first lady disciples who had been killed from their area. And it impacted the church because what was amazing was this. In this culture of violence, the Romans wanted to see blood. They saw something different instead. Whenever they go to the Colosseums to celebrate in their wicked way, they saw people embracing death and being thankful that they were united to Christ. And they realized something. They realized they were celebrating death and destruction. They were celebrating blood and loss of life. But it was hollow. And it had no meaning. And they felt, when they left there, they felt empty. And they realized something. They said, you know what? Those people in that arena that were killed and slaughtered, they lived better lives than I did. And they began to have that hole open in their hearts, and their eyes began to open up, and they began to say to themselves, what is it that they have that's changing their lives? That's what I need. Look at the world around us today. A lot of people out there today will tell you the church has failed. The church has never failed, first and foremost. But this world around us today will tell you that it has because they're afraid of something. They're afraid of the realization that when people stand up and profess Christ, and whenever people get their faith and get their faith wrapped around who they are, and they live true Christian lives, they are afraid that they'll realize how empty their lives are. And that is a truth you can rest upon, because that is exactly what happened to Rome. That's why Rome went from a nation persecuting Christians to a nation, the first empire to embrace Christianity, to grab hold of it. The first nation to embrace Christianity was Armenia. It was the first one, which was part of modern-day Turkey. But the empire itself, after Irenaeus, maybe 50 years, I'm not real good at my dates exactly, but maybe 50 to 100 years after the life of Irenaeus, it was Christian. And it's because they exposed something. They exposed the fact that an empty life is empty. And it had no meaning. Yeah, they could have had entertainment. They could have had all the great and wonderful things, but they didn't have meaning in their lives, and they missed it. And when they saw these people giving up their lives so freely, they realized that whatever it was they had wasn't good enough. And they saw it. Us Christians today, and when I say Christians, I think it's important to note, we may not always know everything about the Bible. We may not always understand it as well as we could. But at the end of the day, whenever we profess Christ and we look toward Him and we have that light in our lives and that type of thirst for life, that we can endure terrible things because we know our life is so much more than just what we see here, that is a true testimony to the power of God. And that right there can change this world. This world, it's frightening how close it is to fully embracing Christ. Because these people, they're looking for something, and they've got this hole in their spirits, and they're looking. And what we have is exactly what they're looking for. We just need to get that message to them. But let's go on. Verse 9. Verse 7. Skipped ahead. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me were the pale horse. His rider was Death, and Hades was fallen close behind him. And they were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by wild beast of the earth. So we talked about the blood-red horse, the martyrs. We talked about the black horse, plague. But do not harm the oil, do not harm the wine. And we feel this final horse coming out. And it's a pale horse. I've heard it described as choleric green. It's sickness is what we find. And it kills through sword, famine, and plague. And of course, he even mentions by wild beast of the earth. And its death was the name, and Hades followed close behind him. Now, if you think about warfare in their time period, death and destruction, social chaos and upheaval, famine, lack of food to feed, these actually kind of play out like that. That's what warfare does. It talks about the idea of having power to kill a quarter of the earth by sword, famine, and plague. A quarter. You know, we talk about the modern day plague that's ongoing. It's not killing a quarter. It's significantly less than that. The exact numbers people will argue over, but we know it's way less than a quarter. But what he's talking about here is something that impacts everyone. It doesn't just impact your neighbor, it impacts in your own home. And that's what they're talking about here. And that's something, whenever we talk about Revelation, that's massive. It's huge. It's on a global scale. People, you'll have to look away to not see. But that brings us to our next verse. Verse 9 says, "When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, 'How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?'" Talking about the red horse. "Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been." And we'll stop right there. This passage right here, this one passage, indicates to us that all of these seals that were broken, they're talking not about a specific point, but they're talking about this is the way that the church is going to survive. That and through all of these terrible things, the death, the destruction, the warfare, the persecution, the martyrs, the church will still survive. Now, some of the other seals we talk about later, they're actually more specific. But these here, it's kind of a general, this is what's going to happen. It's going to happen for quite some time. And even the martyrs who are there in heaven are saying, "Lord, how much longer?" And he says, well, whenever it is, that time that comes, whenever all the martyrs have joined together, whenever we have met our full number, that's when these next things will take place. Now, there's an argument as to where we are in the next things, but for a general overall flow of history, this is actually a good idea to look at it and to realize that all these things will come to be. But let's read on. Verse 12, "I watched as he opened the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned back like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars of the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place." That is symbolic literature, of course. And what's interesting is about the idea of the scroll being rolled up, and this is God finally saying here in the book of Revelation, revealing to John as he is writing it, these are kind of general things, but now we're getting into the direct stuff. Because when you take a scroll, you write on it. It's rolled out, and you're writing on it. But when you're done writing, that's when it's rolled up. And so he's signaling to John in the book of Revelation, all of these things have finally come to fruition. And so from here forward, you're actually beginning to talk about what you could call futuristic events. And so whenever you read the book of Revelation, and I want to highlight this again, never marry yourself to one idea of the interpretation, because there's a lot of things that if you pin yourself to one thought or idea that you may miss. But from this point forward, you can begin to assume you're talking prophetic. You're talking potentially futuristic. You're talking about things that are perhaps yet to come for us. And there's even the idea of some of it may have been and may have happened in the past, but may well be coming again. There's kind of a duality within prophecy. You see within the scripture. You find in the Old Testament, you find the prophecy of the Messiah coming. He came, he died, and he's going to come once more. So there's a duality of that prophetic nature. But what you find here, though, is this. The scroll is wound up. God has said, everything is now complete. And then we go into the end game of this world. Verse 15, it says, "At that, then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called the mountains and the rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on a throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?'" And that's where you begin to see completing the book of Revelation, the judgments begin to come upon those who are wicked. When the end finally comes, the first people who will actually testify to it are the wicked. When the end finally comes, the ones who you have to watch to know that the end's finally coming is whenever they finally say, yeah, our time's up. Those are the ones. When they finally admit it and when they finally begin to see it for themselves, that's when we know that the end is coming. Now, there's another important note about that. Those who are wicked, those who serve evil, because their time's up, will lash out all the more against the church. And I think we've seen that historically, and I think we'll see that yet more. But the primary point when John's writing this book, he's telling his believers, he's telling his followers, his disciples, he says, this is how things are going to generally play out. There is going to be war. There's going to be famine. There's going to be plagues. There's going to be these terrible things. But until all of the martyrs have martyred and laid down their lives, until that time, these things will continue. But the day that the last martyr dies, who will convince and save another, the day that that last martyr dies and is welcomed home in heaven, that's the day of judgment. And at that time was whenever things will begin to change, because that scroll is finally written and is being wrapped up and rolled for the last time. I look forward for the next couple of weeks because I'm going to go into a little bit more into Revelation. I don't preach a lot out of Revelation, but I really feel that Revelation, and I hit on this point a lot earlier, there's a lot of things missing in people's lives today. And if they saw the church for what it really is, because let's be honest, there's a lot of disinformation out there about what the church stands for and what the church believes in. Some of it coming from Rome, of all places. And it's one of those things where if people saw what we really stood for and what we really believe, loving your neighbor as yourself, putting God before everything else, those tenets, they sing with people. They give people meaning in their lives. They help them to find something that bases them with something so much more than what they are. And so I really feel it's an odd thing to say that in the face of so many degenerate and evil things, that there's great hope. And that great hope, of course, comes from the kingdom of God itself. So, in conclusion, we go throughout this week, the book of Revelation, don't be afraid to pick it up. Don't be afraid to study it. Just never marry yourself to one idea. But also, if you have the opportunity, in my case, as I'm going through this podcast I've been listening and learning from, listening to the people who talk to the people who wrote the books, it's a valuable thing. And it's not always possible. Not all the books do we have that kind of information about, but we have it with Revelation. And so I'm going to try to share some of that with us over the next couple weeks, months, and as I come across things that are especially interesting. But the main thing I really wanted to drive home today is the fact that there's great hope in all of this darkness. And with that, let's go ahead and stand for our closing hymn.